What's going on, guys? Flyby Simulations here, and welcome to the very first product review on this channel. So today we're going to be taking a look at the Zinertek Enhanced Airport Graphics texture pack for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. Now, as you can probably tell from the thumbnail of this video, this mod completely overhauls all of the ground textures in and around airports, which includes a whole host of changes to the terminal areas, runways, as well as taxiways to make them look crisper, dirtier, and a lot more realistic overall. So throughout this review, we're going to be taking a look at several different comparisons between default textures provided by Asobo and the ones provided by the mod to see if the €14 price tag is really worth it. Spoiler alert, it very much is. So stay tuned to find out, and if you guys enjoyed the content on here, please consider giving this video a like and maybe even subscribe to the channel if you want to see more such product reviews, full flight episodes, and even tutorials. So without further ado, let's jump into our in-depth review of Zinertek Enhanced Airport Graphics. So let's just start by covering what this mod does and how it works. Simply put, Zinertek Enhanced Airport Graphics completely overhauls the ground textures at every single default airport within the sim. These include textures for runways, taxiways, as well as terminals and parking concourses, all while integrating the sim's already fantastic inbuilt PBR capabilities. Additionally, it's also worth mentioning that the pack only replaces default airport textures provided by Asobo, meaning only the default, deluxe, and premium deluxe airports will be affected by the pack. So if you've purchased dedicated payware scenery from other developers such as Orbex or Fly Tampa, those custom textures will be unaffected by the mod. Just thought I should mention that. As a final note, you might or might not have noticed that there are timestamps throughout this video. These have been put there for a reason, so if you guys wish to check out specific parts of the video and not watch it in a linear fashion, feel free to jump around and check those out as well. Anyways, with that all said, let's start by taking a look at what the runways look like with this add-on. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Singapore Changi International Airport, ICAO code Whiskey Sierra Sierra Sierra, and what you're seeing in the background here is runway 20 right. As you can clearly see, the textures are much darker than the default textures from Asobo. You can also see this dark skid mark patch across the middle of the runway that runs along the initial 500 meters or so of the runway, which is missing in the default version. This is much more realistic because aircraft don't necessarily always land near the center line, and skid marks are created across the runway center line in real life. Furthermore, the actual resolution of the textures themselves has also been greatly improved. You can clearly see how the underlying tiled textures provide a very realistic look and feel of what the runway foundation looks like, and the cracks and shatter textures on top of those further add to the realistic appearance of the runways. Finally, one major stark difference you'll immediately notice between the default textures and those provided by this pack is the significant dirtying of the ground. The white runway markings, including the piano tiles, the runway centerline itself, the runway numbers, as well as the runway threshold, all have a slightly darker tint that imply wear and tear. This is normally the case at major airports such as Singapore, as these runways are trafficked by hundreds of planes every single day, and maintaining squeaky clean white textures like the ones provided by Asobo is simply not realistic. So another point to Zinertek in improving the runway textures overall. Changing the time of day here, again, we can see how the new textures still incorporate PBR beautifully as the sun shines across the asphalt here in Corfu Airport in Greece. Now, though the default textures achieve the same effect, this is just to say that the newer textures don't compromise on any lighting and reflection effects just because they're not proprietary to the sim. So yet another point here given to this fantastic add-on. Finally, I'd also like to point out that not all runways will have the same look and feel. There are major differences between runways that are made out of asphalt, concrete, cement, and bitumen. Take Calgary International Airport here in Canada as an example. As you can clearly see, there are major differences in its appearance as compared to Singapore, which we were looking at previously, as it's made out of a different material. So with that all said, I think the runways have been majorly reworked with this texture pack and provide a more realistic variety for anyone else flying in and out of these airports. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that I'd purchase this pack for the runways alone. The difference is night and day, ladies and gentlemen, and if you'd like to see more footage of these runways, be sure to check out my full flight series on the channel where we take an aircraft from point A to B with realistic procedures and live commentary. You can find a link to the full playlist up here on the top right hand of the screen, as well as in the description section of the video. Anyways, with the runways covered, let's move on to the taxiways and the taxilines to see what modifications have been made there. So, as you would have probably guessed, massive improvements have also been made in this area. To start things off, the first most obvious change you might notice is that the yellow taxiway lines now become much more darker to resemble their real-life counterparts. This has always been an original gripe I had with the default textures, that the yellow taxi lines were way too bright and sported a very light tint that didn't resemble real life whatsoever. This has now been completely reworked with this texture pack, as all yellow taxiway lines now have this deep yellow ochre color, which blends in very well with the darker taxiway colors, the taxiway boundaries, as well as the newer runway textures. Speaking of the taxiways themselves, they have also been significantly beautified. As you can see in the background, just like the runways, the textures are now high resolution, and also have more cracks and imperfections in them to demonstrate the effects of wear and tear on these surfaces over time. There are also occasional liquid spills here and there to try and mimic little pools of water, oil, or other anti-ice fluid around the tarmac, which is again much more realistic than the squeaky clean light gray textures supplied by the base sim. Along with this, the texture pack is also able to allow users to differentiate between more porous materials such as asphalt with those that are much harder like concrete, all of which provide a much more realistic airport navigation experience for the simmer. As we inch ever so closer to the runway again, another great addition that I love here is the inclusion of these black alternating textures near the hold short point. This isn't just an improvement to the original hold short textures, but is a completely new addition, as these are not at all present in the base sim. Additionally, the red runway numerals before entering the runway here are also much more toned down, and also include those amazing cracks that make the entire scene that much more representative of a real airport environment. Again, you can clearly see how the original textures look here, and they just look too clean and bright to me. Finally, we have the taxi lines leading up to the parking spaces. Now, honestly, I would have liked to see some different ICAO code additions as well as more parking lines here to denote where different types of aircraft can park, but unfortunately there are no additions to those textures. However, there are other things about the terminal and parking concourses that have been improved, and we'll get to them in just a moment. So overall, when it comes to the taxiing experience, I can definitely say it has been enhanced, and it does certainly give this add-on another brownie point. So then, speaking of the terminal area and parking concourses, let's talk about changes made to the textures there. Now, as we touched on previously before, there are different shades of gray textures around the airport, and the two most prominent ones are these lighter gray ones and these darker gray ones. The parking concourses often have the lighter gray textures at smaller regional airports with various tiling structures and cracks. The darker structures, or the darker colors I should say, are reserved for larger international airports with more complex taxiways and terminals, such as Sydney Kingsford International Airport that you see in the background here. Both textures obviously look very good, but one thing I don't like about them is the transition between these light and dark gray textures. As you can see here, for example, the transition between these textures is extremely abrupt, making the scene a lot less realistic. Now, the devs have promised to fix this issue universally across all airports, but since it still persists, I thought I'd mention it regardless. Looking at the parking spaces themselves, the dirt textures and the cracks near the gates and aprons look absolutely fantastic. Though I have to say that some of the oil and liquid spill textures near these spaces are quite massive and are overdone to some extent. Instead of looking like a well-maintained parking spot, they instead signify some inconsistent and shoddy work done by the ground staff. When looking at the tiled, lighter textures, they look great. They're dirty and imperfect in just the right places to enhance realism. Final note on the parking spaces: for the deluxe and premium deluxe airports with custom gates and aprons with signages, the red and white aircraft outlines have also been improved. You can see this clearly again at Sydney Airport, and I have to say that they're a significant improvement over the default textures. Next up, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at the effect of specific weather conditions on these textures to see if the PBR standards, as well as the reflections and anisotropic filtering standards hold up. We'll specifically be taking a look at rain and snow and see their effects on all of the different textures we have talked about so far. So, starting with rain, you can clearly see that the tiled gray textures here do look absolutely stunning, both up close as well as at a distance. The minor cracks and imperfections are visible and in some cases are distorted due to the water, all of which leads to a very accurate and realistic rendition of the scene. When it comes to the taxi lines themselves, they also take on a darker yellow undertone to signify they are wet and have another layer of liquid over them, namely the rain itself. The wet effect, as can be seen, is very realistic around the bends, and the same effect is also extended over to the runway lines and markings. The white textures automatically become a little darker, transitioning over to the grayer side, and the uneven slope and elevation of the runway also causes some water to disperse and some to stay, allowing for more realism on the ground. Next up, let's take a look at snow then. Now, when it comes to these textures, I have to say that I'm not mighty impressed. I would have liked to see them be better represented, and in some cases would even venture to say that the default Asobo textures do a better job masking the ground and covering it with snow where required. As you can see in these parking spaces, the snow textures are sparse and are littered across the ground. From the flight deck of the aircraft, this would definitely provide a realistic look with the white snowy textures on the ground. When looking at the taxiway and runway textures, here is where things start to go into the unrealistic territory. You can clearly see how there is absolutely no snow on any of the taxiways, and the white textures don't mask the yellow taxi lines whatsoever. When it comes to the runways, the white textures on the runway are overdone in my opinion, and they start taking on a much cleaner look. You can see a collection of snow on either side of the runway, but again, no snow has been collected on the actual runway itself, which I personally feel detracts from the realism the mod should provide. So when it comes to weather conditions and their effects on these textures, I would say that both rain and snow textures do look great, though I would say that the snow textures could do with some more work. So I'll give the mod half a point in this department. Alright, so for the final section in this video, I just wanted to make some remarks about the performance impacts this mod has, as well as freeware alternatives, and to just overall wrap a neat little bow around the whole review. So, starting with performance, I'm happy to report that the texture pack has absolutely no impact on the FPS within the sim. The textures used are higher resolution for sure, but somehow, Zinertek has managed to optimize the textures to be extremely FPS friendly. So if that's something that was holding you from purchasing this add-on, then you have nothing to be worried about. That being said, on the FlightSim.2 website, there is a freeware alternative to this mod called Better Ground Markings. Just to be clear, as much as the actual freeware mod is great and all, it comes nowhere near the payware equivalent. The only thing this mod changes is taxiway lines and makes them darker yellow. No changes are made to the actual runway textures or terminal concourses or even the ground textures throughout the airport. However, that being said, if you're tired of the squeaky clean taxi lines, then this freeware alternative might be good for you for the time being. All in all though, coming back to the actual Zinertek mod in question, I have to say it's well worth the price tag of €14. For this price, you get thousands of new refurbished, realistic looking airports with consistent updates by Zinertek making it continuously better. So ladies and gentlemen, now that you've seen the full review, my final verdict on the mod, as you could have probably predicted, would be to definitely give it a try. Now, would I have preferred something like Airport Environment HD for X-Plane 11, which is absolutely freeware? Sure. But what you're forgetting when you make that assumption is that MSFS 2020 has hundreds of default textures at airports compared to the handful in the previous generation of simulators like X-Plane 11 and P3D. Hence, it's significantly harder to create airport textures for this sim that preserve realism while also creating variety and keeping the whole experience performance friendly for all systems. So, hope you guys actually go for this product, and I hope people can start finding the same enjoyment with it as I do. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to perform a full stop landing at the like button and the subscribe button, and press the bell icon for future notifications from this channel. Also, be sure to fly by the comment section and let me know if there's any questions you'd like me to answer for you. As usual, thanks for flying by.